In part 1 of this topic, we explored why formatting multiple worksheets at the same time was beneficial and how styles can be used to extend those benefits. Now we want to take a look at how conditional formatting can be brought into the fold, as well as optimizing it all through the creation and use of formatting macros. Conditional formatting, of course, is something that we can do with any worksheet, and it has several benefits. Conditional formatting automates the formatting based on conditions of a cell. The formatting is then applied when a condition is found to be true. You must be able to create a criteria that can be evaluated as true or false. For example, you could say if the value of a cell is greater than 100, or if the value of that cell is less than the average of the column values in which this cell exists. You could also say maybe if a cell contains certain text, or if a date occurs in the future. All of those things can be evaluated as either being true or false. With conditional formatting, if they're evaluated as true, then the formatting will be applied. Now, conditional formatting used to be limited to 3 things. You could change the font, the fill, and/or the border. But those were the old days. The newer versions of Excel provide very elegant options, and these include the use of icon sets, gradient cell shading, data bars, and color scales. We can see a couple of examples here. For example, with our initial dollar figures, we can see that a $5 amount has a red X. That's a bad number for whatever reason. A number in the middle, like $100, may have a red exclamation mark, but anything that we see, like the number 2,500, is good and it gets a green check mark. This, of course, makes the cell values very visual, without having to actually consider what the value itself is. Below that, we can see the use of data bars. Now, these are actually 4 separate cells. They each contain a value, $5, $100, $1,500, and $2,500. Since these 4 cells have the formatting applied, Excel automatically takes a look at the range, in this case from 5 to 2,500. It then applies a data bar that represents those values in relationship to each other. Since 5 is the lowest, it doesn't have any data bar. Since 2,500 is the highest, the complete cell is filled in other words, 100%. 1,500 and 100 also show their relative standing within the range of values that are present. And of course, all of these things happen dynamically. As we change the value of cells, the actual formatting, as well as how the calculation is done, for example, in our second case, the fact that it's 5 to 2,500, is taken into consideration, but handled completely by Excel, with no intervention needed by us. Conditional formatting is managed by something called the Rules Manager. The Rules Manager allows us to create, edit, and delete conditional formatting rules for any specific cell or selection of cells. The Rules Manager allows us to apply some very complex conditional formatting sets. By that, we mean that we can actually apply more than one conditional formatting rule to a cell. For example, it could contain both an icon set and a data bar. We also can designate to stop if any of the conditions are found to be true. Now you can see on the right side of the screenshot here that it's just a checkbox. When you go through rules, Excel runs them from the top down. So if we have a list with multiple rules, it starts at the top, and we can say if that first rule is found to be true, stop, don't look at it anymore. But if it's not, it will continue on to the second, the third, the fourth, and so forth. Of course, if you don't check the box, then all of the rules will be run through and any of them that are true will be applied. That means that the order of rules can really be important. As we said, if you want it to stop after a certain thing is found to be true, then those need to come first in the list. We can actually see an example of a problem here. The cell that we have currently shown is showing a value of 10%. We have several rules in place. One of them says if the cell value is greater than 4%, to apply a red fill with a darker red font. The last rule that we see says if the cell value is greater than or equal to 10%, then it should be formatted differently. However, that format has not been applied. That's because the first value was found to be true, and because those that are higher in the list, in other words, those that come first take precedence, it never gets to the last criteria. In order to fix this, we would simply need to reorder the rules so that the cell value being greater than or equal to 10% comes before the rule talking about it being greater than 4%. It's really a good idea when you work with conditional formatting to modify and change and play with the values to make sure things work exactly as you'd expect. But the order of rules is important, as is the ability to say stop if something is true. And testing is always a good idea. Formatting is one of the basic Excel skills many of us learn early on in our Excel experience. And it's easy to see how, when used extensively, formatting features aren't necessarily difficult, they just take a lot of time. That includes both regular formatting as well as setting up conditional formats. So how do we take all of the benefits of traditional and conditional formatting and styles and make them even more efficient? The answer is macros. Now, please don't panic on me. Take a deep breath. Macros are not difficult. They are simply a recording of actions in Excel, the stuff that you already do. They can be very complex, and they can even involve Visual Basic for Applications or VBA code. But remember, code is never required to do macros. All you have to do is hit the record button, do the things that you already do in Excel, and then stop the recording. Then you're simply able to replay those steps anytime that you want or need it. That's all a macro is. In fact, you can choose whether your macro is available just in the current workbook, or you can record a macro and make those steps available to any Excel file you use on your computer. This is called being local or global, and it's just a matter of making a simple selection before you start recording the macro. So, this not only will help you when working with multiple worksheets, it's also going to extend to multiple workbooks as well. And because macros can be run from the ribbon or through keyboard shortcuts, you also don't have to modify the way you work best, be it via mouse or the keyboard. There typically aren't macros that come as templates or things that you can pre-use like in a gallery. You generally have to create your own macros. So I've come up with a recommended macro process to help simplify it as you work through it, at least your first few times. It really is fairly simple. The first step is to plan your macro. What is it that you want to do, and how are you going to go about doing it? Maybe even write it down. Then practice it. Run through it a couple of times on your worksheet to make sure that you can do it efficiently and without kind of fumbling around and looking for things or making mistakes. Then you'll actually record the macro, running through the steps as you normally would and now have done at least a couple of times. If necessary, you can edit macros. That does involve opening up a VBA editor, and that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But if you make a little bit of a fumble, or if you have a little typo and don't recognize it when you're recording, you can go back and fix it very easily, again, without having to know code. It's just editing text. And the last step, of course, is to use your macro. You or anybody else that uses your workbook will have access to it. And this whole process really, again, is very simple and straightforward. No code is necessary. You're just going to practice what you need to do and then record it cleanly so that it can be used again later on. So once you go through this simple process of planning, practicing, recording, editing, and then you're ready to use it, you actually are just that, ready to use and reuse your macro. There's a couple of best practices I always like to remind people about, though. First of all, when you name your macro, keep your name short, alphanumeric with no spaces, and make them descriptive. For example, if it's going to format the column headings, then call it Format Column Headings so you know exactly what each macro does. Next, be sure that you record all of the steps as cleanly as possible. That's why you practice ahead of time. The macro recorder does not actually record time, so go slow and prevent mistakes, especially typos. So if you need to do one thing and then stop for just a second and think about what you're about to do, feel free to do so. That pause that you know is there is not recorded as part of the macro. Excel only keeps track of the actions that you take on screen, not time. And lastly, if you make a mistake, correct it and go on, unless it's a really big one, and then you might want to stop and record it over from scratch. But if you make a small typo, just backspace and type it over, and it will be part of your macro, or sometimes Excel just takes that out, but it doesn't matter because it's all going to happen so quickly on screen that the end result is what's important, rather than perfection. Most importantly, if you haven't worked with macros before, remember that formatting macros don't have to be difficult. You can create them doing the same things that you do every day, except now you're just going to record them at the same time. Using macros along with conditional formatting and styles simply allow you to work with multiple worksheets in the simplest way possible.